As I said at the beginning of the service, I want us to consider this morning the two parables of about the yeast and about the mustard seed. And there are at least two problems with these parables from Matthew's Gospel in my thinking. The first is that they are so familiar that we allow them to wash over us because we've heard them preached so often that we feel we know what they're about. And secondly, they've generated a whole ton of scholarly debate about their meaning, a volume that is inversely proportional to their size. The briefer the parable, the greater the debate, and that's especially true of the mustard seed and the yeast. My studies of late have taken me to look at these parables afresh, and I'm indebted to the work of Professor Amy Jill Levine, who is Professor of New Testament Studies at Vanderbilt University Divinity School, located in Nashville, Tennessee. Professor Levine is, I think, unusual is that she teaches New Testament studies whilst also being an Orthodox Jew. In reading Professor Levine's work, I suggest that when we read the parables in particular, we do a number of things. We don't take them literally. We don't even assume that they are metaphorical, because usually they are not. Neither should we attach metaphors to them, because they wouldn't have been intended by Jesus, and if they are our metaphors, then we attach our own agenda to them. For example, the birds of the air nesting in the mustard tree are the nations of the world coming home into the kingdom of God. No, they're not. They're just birds. Parables are illustrations, if you will, that emphasise a truth that we've probably already knew, but perhaps we'd forgotten and needed reminding. Oh, and the Jewish way of parable telling is not averse to an amount of exaggeration for dramatic effect. You'll see what I mean in a moment. Matthew has placed these two parables together, so let's see what they have in common. In the parable of the mustard seed, we find the first piece of dramatic license for the mustard seed is not the smallest of seeds. There are two that are smaller, but that's not the point. It's small, and is placed in the field with the expectation it will grow. And in the parable, it does. But depending on which variety of mustard it is, the best it can do is a large shrub, perhaps as high as 8 feet, and to some it might look like a tree, but it isn't. Again, it doesn't matter. From something small, something very small, something grows that is big enough to provide shelter for birds. In the second, we find a woman doing some baking, taking the fermenting yeast and hiding it within the flour. The New Revised Standard Version translation says that she mixed the yeast or leaven with the flour, which is an understandable thing for a baker to do, but the original Greek is better translated as hides. She hides the yeast in a vast amount of flour. 3 measures equates to a modern day 40 to 60 pounds, which, if you've ever done any bread making, is a lot of mixing, an awful lot of kneading, and a huge amount of bread. Another example of dramatic exaggeration. I think so, but don't get hung up on the detail. The Bible is neither a botanical almanac, nor is it a recipe book. To quote Professor Levine, what these parables share is first size. Yeast and seed are small, and the tree and yield are large. Second, both play on the theme of secrecy. The yeast is hidden, and the seed grows out of sight in the earth. Third, the mustard seed and the yeast are both about the necessities of life, bread and shelter. Finally, each shows that a person's actions have a possible impact on life outside the immediate context. That is, the people who will come to eat the enormous amount of bread the woman has produced, and the birds that will nest in the branches of the mustard tree. At the end of our Gospel reading this morning, Jesus asked the disciples, "Have you understood all this?" And they answer, "Yes," which I find interesting, given that throughout the Gospels the disciples don't seem to have a great track record on understanding what Jesus taught, but I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. These are parables about the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven, so we may say that Jesus told these parables as a word of encouragement to his followers. We may be a small group, and our message may not be going down too well, especially with those in authority, but great things can grow from small beginnings. Very similar to God encouraging the childless Abraham in Genesis chapter 15. God brought him outside and said, "Look towards heaven and count the stars, if you are able to count them." Then God said to him, "So shall your descendants be." We know all too well that small things, such as a virus, can have a significant effect across the world. So we should not minimise or trivialise the effect that a small kingdom action that we might take may have. Like the seed and the yeast, their growth into something larger takes place hidden away, perhaps in the hearts of those we have walked alongside. Both the seed and the yeast in some form contain life. Our actions on behalf of the kingdom have the potential to bring life. Even small actions have the potential to produce great things. The two parables also share the fact that both seed and yeast were left alone. In these days of mission plans and management speak becoming more and more within the life of the church, I do wonder if this parable can teach us that small is beautiful and doesn't always need planning to the nth degree. Sometimes kingdom things just need to be planted and left to get on. And perhaps as the minister, I just need to get out of the way, or at least be the facilitator rather than the focus, to be the woman creating the bread or the farmer sowing the seed. Constantly fiddling with the dough while it's rising or checking to see if the seed has germinated will end in failure. The bread and the tree are more important than the baker and the sower, at least in these parables. Finally, both parables are set within a very domestic setting, the village bakery and the local garden or field, the daily actions of men and women. This is where the kingdom of heaven can be found, in the care for our neighbour, our concern for our local environment, and so on. Yes, the big campaigns have their place, but the challenge of the parables is that the when is much less important than the where. The timing of the bread rising or the mustard tree coming to maturity will happen when it happens. There is little we can do to hasten either. Where is the kingdom of God? It's already present in the world, waiting to be found, present when love, care, generosity, kindness, joy, peace, and other positive aspects of being human are shared and shown to others and to the natural world in which we live. As disciples, it's our calling to show the kingdom to others. In these difficult times, this calling becomes even more important. So may God bless us in our baking and in our sowing of seed.